We'll start with the discussion, Dr. Ali, and then myself a little bit, and then we'll open the floor for questions. Please.
Okay. Well, first I want to thank you for a very comprehensive presentations. Now, I want to start with talking about philanthropy. When we talk about philanthropy in general, I mean, it actually, the context of it started in North America, in the US. And you could argue to a large extent that it started after the robber barons. Robber barons, I mean the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Ford accumulated enough wealth. And then they were trying to sort of, perhaps it was a tax evasion. Some of it actually was whitewashing. I mean, the Carnegie Foundation, for example, started after there was a huge massacre of laborers who were demonstrating in a steel mill that was owned by Carnegie. So it was whitewashing in many aspects. And an interesting thing, when you look at it from a historical perspective, at that time Ted Roosevelt was against giving tax exemptions to philanthropies because of reasons that you've mentioned, that he thought it would be a backdoor to influence society. Now, why is that relevant to us? Because it's happening now, again. I mean, lots of people argue that the fourth revolution could actually find a reincarnation of the robber barons again in different forms. I mean, you find somebody who makes becomes a billionaire in a very short duration, and then he tries to bribe a federal judge without mentioning names. But I'm sure most of you would know whom I'm talking about. Now, when we talk about inequality in general, which is what we're trying to alleviate, inequality is a structural problem. A structural problem that actually you could argue that the wealthy took advantage of to make their own wealth. And there are lots of people, for example, Darren Walker, who was the Ford Foundation president, and even the Winner Takes All, the book. They argue that why, if I'm a wealthy person, that I took advantage of the inequality to make wealth, would I actually invest in alleviating or restructuring that might impact in my capability of making my own wealth again? You see what I'm saying? There is a contradiction. There is a conflict of interest of some way. Now, I want to get into a different kind of giving in general. When you look at giving anywhere in the world, we tend to focus on big philanthropy because it tends to be big numbers, very concentrated. But when you look at the statistics, and it's in the US and it's everywhere, giving actually is a you and I giving. It's not the rich people. It's about the individual person giving money. And this is the case even in the US or anywhere. Some of our friends back that we collaborate with in South Africa, they call it the poor philanthropist. A poor philanthropist is you and I can afford to give £100 a month, but there are 50 million of us. Now, so you can see right away that we have a higher capability than even most business people. Now, what is the problem of this? The problem of how do we channel it? We tend to channel it in a poor way and more around alleviating immediate needs instead of getting people out of the poverty trap. So it's an issue of how do you use those resources. Now, I want to talk about a slightly different thing. When there is something called the pioneer gap, and let me explain what it is. When you look at investment, there is a whole slew of investment options. Early stage in investment, there is no commercial proposition at all. So that's why you have to rely on things like friends and families, because to get a proof of concept. Now, once you get a proof of concept, then it becomes palatable to somebody who's more willing to take a slight risk, and then eventually it becomes mainstream, so a banker will be able to invest in it. Now, this has nothing to do, by the way, with social. It's just a fact of life, just a law of physics in any investment. In a commercial investment, for example, when you talk about pure science R&D, who's paying for it? Either government or philanthropy, because there is no return on investment, immediate return on investment. And the reason for that is that because you're not just developing a company. You're not developing your own venture business. You're developing a market. You're developing an industry. Developing an industry or a market, there is a huge fixed charge that somebody has to pay for it, and mostly investors with a very narrow return on investment expectations, like 5 years or even 10 years, it's not going to cut it. You're really talking about 30, 40 years or perhaps more. And this applies across. So and that ties it to transformative versus non-transformative, because you're talking about either linear change or a non-linear change. A non-linear change means somebody's going to dislodge. This is a drastic investment that you'll have to rely. And the reason I'm talking about this, because there is a nice spectrum. There isn't a one party that's going to do the whole lifting. Part of it is philanthropy plays a major role. And then impact investment plays a major role. And then regular banking or regular investment plays also an important role if you think about the whole thing across the development life cycle. Now, I'm going to get back to the investment part, which is the inequality. There are lots of people talking about democratizing economy, democratizing giving, democratizing. And when you talk about democratizing, it's all about bottom up. It's not about just including the community aspect. Let me give you a very interesting fact. When you look at what social enterprises, I mean, with the exception of some US-centric, I mean, in US, when we talk about social entrepreneurs, it tends to be very individualistic, a person who has a brilliant idea, who just lands in a parachute in an area, and then he shows them the salvation, the road to salvation. Now, there are many models which is actually community-driven. I mean, social entrepreneurs, for example, social enterprises in the UK started as community development associations. Those are a community coming together and taking control of their commercial aspect and developing commercial or business-like solutions to solve their own problems. And I think this is the trick. When you talk about democratizing economy, we're talking about, like you've said, laborers, workers in a company, owning a company. We're talking about associations, cooperatives, that type of a thing. In the end, what's going to make a system running is the governance of an ecosystem. And governance of an ecosystem meaning there is decent checks and balances between the different powers, and there is enough power which is coming from the bottom. If you don't have this, then you're going to have inequality. And sometimes a government would actually force this, and sometimes it happens with a better mechanism. I think now I have only one comment, which is for, I mean, it's a question. It's, for me, socially responsible investment is not impact investment. There is a huge socially responsible, which is ESG, for example, environmental social governance, which is I'm a banker, I'm trying to invest, so I'm going to make sure that my investment is not going to have either an environmental or a social, and it's going to be in a well-governed entity, and this is just to mitigate risk. For me, this is more of do no harm or risk mitigation. It does not do good. Mm-hmm. It prevents doing harm, but it does not do good. Do good is going further step, and it requires better engagement with the entity you're trying to play with. And this is what impact investment should be at.
So,
Thank you.
Thank you. No, and I think I skipped a bit of the history, so I'm happy to jump back there in terms of how did this come about, right, and the different terms over time. Like all things in human society, it comes back to Africa, right, to the cradle of civilization. That the first recorded impact investors were actually, sorry, I'll stand up again. In the 1600s, there was a religious organization called the Quakers, that their two kind of main features is they're pro-pacifist, that's a hard word, pacifists against war and against slavery. And they refused to profit from any companies that were involved in the slave trade. And they went so far as they wouldn't even put sugar in their tea. They only used maple syrup, right, from the north of the US, because it was a way of protesting slavery and protesting the corporations, right? So you actually then had an evolution over time, largely led by religious orders, and people often refer to the sin stocks as the original screens or the original pieces of ESG, very much the S of the ESG. So you had, largely in the US, it was Catholics and Protestants who wouldn't invest in alcohol, who wouldn't invest in alcohol, tobacco, or firearms. And you have similarly, nowadays, there's like, obviously, you know, the field of Islamic finance, right? And some of the limitations that are put on investments. So really, it's hundreds and hundreds of years old, the idea of your values can be reflected, but that was very much in a, I don't want X, right? And I think that, in any sort of process of social transformation, saying no to things gets very dull after a while, right? That it's really much more interesting to be building things. I know that many of people in the room who have been part of building businesses, right, and building enterprises, that's really where you can get engaged and excited, and also knowing for a lot of business people who had that experience, it's great to give away money to social projects, but when you get to help build a social enterprise, right, of really being able to directly apply your skills of, I don't want to just, you know, paint the wall of a school, but I want to be part of establishing multiple schools or whatever it might be. So essentially you had this transition over time of people beyond just saying no to the types of companies and practices they don't want, of saying, what is it that we really want to see, right? And that goes back to that definition of impact investment, investments intended to generate a positive social and environmental return, so that we are explicitly seeking projects that are going to have that environment and social value. And that's a big distinction between often how corporate social responsibility, or ESG, in the public markets gets positioned in that do no harm way, versus how can we proactively really show up as our best selves in business, and be thinking about not just what we sometimes call the difference between the how and the what. So the what is what the product is, right? So we can do renewable energy instead of fossil fuels. But then the how is, how are we doing it? Are we paying living wages? Are we creating opportunities for broad-based ownership as opposed to limiting it to a couple families? Are we looking at sustainability practices throughout all of our operations, right? So that we have to get both of those things right if we really want to do the most in-depth impact investing that we can.
Let me give you a few comments as well. Okay, you actually started by answering one key question that I had, but I still need a bit more. All right, which is really drawing the line between corporate social responsibility, social enterprise, and can we say impact investors, or we can say that impact investment is the outcome of any kind of investment, as long as it says whatever has a good impact on the people would be labeled impact investment, irrespective of the structure of the company we're talking about, social enterprise, a corporation, or government. I think it's important to have the definitions. I want very briefly actually to tell you just a few things. There are things that you said that, you know, there are things that touch the heart, okay, when you say them, okay? So I want to repeat them for you, okay? The fact that what is spent on philanthropy, what goes really affects social justice was not more than 12%. This is disastrous, okay? This is why people pay the money and they feel good about it and nothing comes out of it. By the way, the little money that goes in philanthropy is what counts. When you were saying this, I remembered Barack Obama, in his campaign, when Oprah Winfrey was saying that actually the blacks in the US were paying $5 bills and $1 bills, and this is how a huge amount of money was produced to support a president that they wanted. So I mean, it matters. So giving back, okay, and not taking, all right? And if you invest twice as much in the problem than in the solution, you cannot expect to win, all right? This not only applies to individuals, it applies to governments, and I will give you a few examples from Egypt that will make you, you can add to your book. Beautifully so.
For the Middle Eastern edition.
For the Middle Eastern edition, yeah. And the gin versus tonic is genial. It's genius. All right. Other than the definition, the three concepts that you have talked about in order to have impact investment: engaging the community, adding more value than extracting, and balancing the risk. Okay, they look and they fit very much something that we are actually doing at ECES here, irrespective of the impact investment aside. We're doing it on public policy. We're teaching people from the government and from institutions how to do cost-benefit analysis for a public policy. When you adopt a public policy, you have to ask exactly these questions. Who is it going to affect? Is there a better solution? Did you get the community involved, yes or no, et cetera, because it's not happening. So the impact investment, I think, is a message that needs to go to governments more than anybody else. Okay, I can give you a few examples from Egypt that will make you, like I said, you can add them to your book with a big smile. Okay, one of them, okay, has to do with the vendors, the people who sell in the streets, all those informal people. We have lots of them in downtown. The government regularly does what I'm going to tell you, regularly. All right, there's a campaign, sudden campaign. They come with trucks, they take their stuff, they tell them to go away. And they keep on policing the place for 2 or 3 weeks afterwards. Downtown is nice and clean. Then 2 or 3 weeks afterwards, they come back. Okay? All right. Then you ask, why do these people come back? We have this incredible place for them. Okay? 100 kilometers away, why aren't they happy? I mean, we have a booth for each and every one of them. Okay? Right? Turns out they haven't talked to them at all. All right? So they did not listen to these people as if they don't exist. All right, you have created a nice location for them, but one where there is absolutely no circulation, no traffic, nobody is coming. They will never be able to sell their goods, so they come back. So you are never seeking a full solution because you are not actually seeking. We are not putting them as part of the. When you make them part of the problem, they become part of the solution. But you are not doing that. This is one example. Another example are actually governmental projects. We have a transformation that's happening in a place called Masr Gedida in Egypt. Anyone who lives there is going to have a very big smile. Look at them, they're smiling. All right? They're improving the location traffic-wise and so on. And it's killing the community. We have a similar project in Alexandria. Changes. Community was not involved at all. They woke up one day and they found big transformation in the city that they hate living in right now. So I think impact investment is a message that should go primarily to governments, even a lot more than to the private sector. I need you to tell us a little bit more about what developing countries like ours can do. We have an incredible size of informal sector. Okay, we don't have our informal sector is bigger than our formal sector, so you cannot expect terribly much from the formal sector. Okay, in dealing, you cannot. What are the regulations that are needed to encourage the little private sector that exists to take this direction and to go for impact investment? Okay, what is it that is needed? And there's something else that I'm trying to remember. I think to read to catch from all the scribbling that I've been doing. I want to ask you how. And the infrastructure projects. Infrastructure project again is a governmental message. I mean, governments are engaged in infrastructure projects. Sometimes it's too much, sometimes it's too little. Where do you draw the line? What are the criteria, specific criteria for any investment, private or local, to be labeled having an impact investment? And then finally, I know from your book that your interest in impact investment started with the tuna can. All right, so I want you to tell the story to our audience. I'm not going to say it on your behalf, but you will say it.
I will try to remember all 4 of those, and feel free to jump back in if I forget. I wanted to just to start with an observation. I think one of the mistakes that impact investors, particularly Americans, I think have made, that I think you have the opportunity not to replicate, is ignoring government. Is ignoring the critical role of government, and that sometimes we're just looking at how do we solve this problem. For instance, like how do we get water to a distant community that's experiencing drought, and we figure, we'll sell water, right? That's the most efficient way to get something to a region, and then we forget about human rights, and we forget about the idea that the purpose of government ideally is to address the idea that there are basic human rights, right? Whether that's housing, water, food, or even just freedom of expression and the space to be able to exercise our full humanity. That these are things that governments ideally guarantee for people. And that if we try to bring in private businesses to replace the role of government in providing for basic human rights, we can wind up with some serious problems. So there's things like in Liberia, Bridge Academy, which is a for-profit elementary school, was contracted to take over the entire school system for the country. So they're a venture-backed organization that the Chan Zuckerberg initiative, right? The founder of Facebook has invested millions and millions of dollars in. They've done pretty well as a company. What happens if they fold, right? You now have a country that has had years of not training its own teachers because they just use the curriculum on the tablets that's provided by this US-based company. That's, in my opinion, terrible. Like, that is a massive risk. And that's when you think about if the government's... So how do we make sure that, you know, we keep the government's role from a human rights perspective really front and center, that can always partner with the private sector for the delivery of services, right? But that the actual guarantee of services still sits as a basic government commitment to its people. And I know that in every country that functions very differently. But in keeping that in mind, in what's the appropriate roles for the private sector to play. And I think that, so then getting into infrastructure, right? So then that gets into this question, the cost benefit and infrastructure for whom? So how do you prioritize certain populations? How do you make sure that you're getting the time and the feedback that you need? And recognizing that in most infrastructure projects, there isn't a budget line for community consultation. There isn't, you know, in the timeline of a project plan, is there 6 months of community meetings before you break ground, right? So recognizing that these are actual concrete activities, and that sometimes people think of these things as soft skills, and actually that it gets genderized, right? That, oh, that sort of thing, it's, you know, impact is what just women do. That's not true, right? And it goes back to, if we want to reduce risk in these projects, we need to make sure that we're integrating those different perspectives, that we're valuing all those different skills at the table, and making sure that we really get those voices part of the process. But that means time and money. Right? So it can't just be, you know, focusing on how much for the cement, how much for the sand, et cetera, but for the whole process to be effective is really critical. And then the can of tuna story, I'll give the short version, and unfortunately we don't have the book here with us today. You can find it on Amazon or on Kindle, but the purpose of the story and getting into the story, so I got into impact investment because I was an activist, essentially, and that I didn't necessarily have any particular love of investments. It's more that I was looking for what is the most effective vehicle for social change that I can find. And I had thought that I was going to work in development, that I was going to wind up with USAID or a UN posting. I did work for the UN for a little while, but basically figured that if you wanted to make social change, that's how you did it, right? You worked in development finance or development in an NGO capacity. And I was in Sierra Leone in West Africa a year after the Civil War had ended. They'd gone through an absolutely brutal civil war. This is about 18 years ago. And at the time, in most of the country, people were only eating once a day at like 3 p.m. And I was a well-fed American, right, who was really not used to this, and spending time in the countryside. And there was a time in passing through a little town that I was just picking up some supplies so that I could at least have breakfast on my own, and I would kind of sneak food into my room, which I felt terrible about, but otherwise just having lunch at 3 p.m., right, was like really rough. So I was buying Weetabix, you know, you can always find that in former British colonies, and I saw a can of tuna, and I was so excited. I'd been there for months and was a big, you know, tuna fish sandwich fan, is a very American thing. And I went up to the woman and I looked at the can, and it said, "Do not sell, World Food Program, gift of Japan," right? And I asked the woman, "Hey, where did you get this?" Right? And then pointing at the, you know, the do not sell, right? Like you're selling this to me. What's going on? And she spoke probably 4 different native languages, but English was not one of them. So she basically just said, here's how much it is, do you want it or not? And I bought that can, and I kept it on my mantelpiece for about a decade, until one of my roommates threw it out, and I was very mad at them. But basically, what I calculated in thinking about it, so because I was a US aid worker, I was getting paid a monthly salary, which meant that unlike folks in Sierra Leone who were making, if they were lucky, $2 a day, right, that I had this disposable income. And with $1 in Sierra Leone, the price of that can of tuna, that woman could buy 6 heaping plates of rice and greens and fish, ironically, right? And could have fed 12 people, as opposed to this tiny can that could barely feed 1, right? So she absolutely was a rational economic actor. She sold the can, right? Even though it was given to her as food aid. And the idea is I was kind of tracing that economic journey. So there were the fishermen in Japan who were subsidized by the Japanese government, essentially to overfish, to be able to make this tuna. It then gets packaged, sent through the FAO in Italy, and there's a whole group of people paid there. Then got to the World Food Program in Sierra Leone to be given to this woman only to sell it to an American. So if you added that all up, it was probably 60 times more economic value that got taken right out of the country than was actually delivered to that woman in value. And that was the moment, going back to this idea of non-extraction, that if I made my career out of that, I was going to keep stealing from poor people. And that structurally felt wrong, felt really wrong. And started to really make me think, how could I engage in a way, at the very minimum, to be non-extractive, at a very minimum to make sure I was leaving more resources in communities than I was taking back out. So that was essentially the end of my development career.
This is absolutely true. Absolutely true that lots of money dedicated to development actually go in the wrong direction altogether. It goes in the form of salaries for people who do not need them at all.